Today, we're telling one of the most dramatic stories in modern history, the story of spaceflight. It begins with fear, rivalry, and war. It grows into one of humanity's greatest scientific adventures. And today, it has entered a new phase where governments are no longer the only players, and private companies like SpaceX are reshaping what it means to reach space. This is the history of spaceflight, from the space race to SpaceX. To understand the beginning of spaceflight, we have to start on Earth, in the shadow of World War II. The rockets that would eventually launch satellites, astronauts, and probes to distant planets did not begin as peaceful tools of exploration. Modern rocketry was built on military technology. In Nazi Germany, engineers developed the V-2 rocket, the world's first long-range guided ballistic missile. It was a terrifying weapon, but it also proved something revolutionary. A rocket could travel to the edge of space. After the war, both the United States and the Soviet Union rushed to capture German rocket technology, documents, and scientists. Among them was Wernher von Braun, who would later become one of the key architects of the American space program. At the same time, Soviet engineers, led by the brilliant and secretive Sergei Korolev, were building their own rocket systems. By the 1950s, the Cold War had transformed science into a battleground. The United States and the Soviet Union were not only competing for military strength, they were competing for prestige, ideology, and proof that their system represented the future. Then, in 1957, the Soviet Union shocked the world. On October 4, 1957, the Soviets launched Sputnik 1, the first artificial satellite to orbit Earth. It was a polished metal sphere, not much bigger than a beach ball, but its impact was enormous. As it passed overhead, broadcasting a simple radio beep, people around the world realized that humanity had entered the space age. In the United States, Sputnik triggered panic and urgency. If the Soviets could launch a satellite, they could also launch nuclear weapons across continents. The response was immediate. The U.S. government expanded science education, increased funding for research, and in 1958 created NASA, the National Aeronautics and Space Administration. The race was now officially on. The next major step was sending a human into space. Once again, the Soviet Union got there first. In April 1961, Yuri Gagarin became the first human to travel into space and orbit the Earth. His flight lasted just 108 minutes, but it made him an international hero. Gagarin's calm smile and famous phrase, "Poyakali," meaning, "let's go," became symbols of a new era. The United States answered just weeks later with Alan Shepard, the first American in space, though his flight was suborbital rather than orbital. It was a start, but the Soviets still held the lead. Then came one of the most ambitious political speeches of the 20th century. In 1961, President John F. Kennedy declared that the United States would land a man on the moon and return him safely to Earth before the decade was out. It was a breathtaking goal. At the time, America had only just begun sending people into space. But Kennedy understood something important. The moon was not just a scientific destination. It was a stage on which the superpowers would demonstrate technological superiority. NASA responded by building a ladder to the moon in 3 major steps: Mercury, Gemini, and Apollo. Project Mercury proved that humans could survive in space. Project Gemini developed the skills needed for lunar missions, including spacewalks, long-duration flights, and docking spacecraft in orbit. These were essential techniques for reaching the moon and coming home safely. Then came Apollo. The Apollo program remains one of the greatest engineering efforts in human history. Hundreds of thousands of people worked on it. Enormous Saturn V rockets were built to carry astronauts beyond Earth orbit. Computers, guidance systems, life support, and navigation technologies had to be created or radically improved. But the road was not smooth. In 1967, tragedy struck during a ground test of Apollo 1, when a cabin fire killed astronauts Gus Grissom, Ed White, and Roger Chaffee. Their deaths were a devastating reminder that spaceflight is never routine. NASA investigated, redesigned critical systems, and pressed forward. Finally, in July 1969, Apollo 11 reached the moon. Neil Armstrong and Buzz Aldrin descended in the lunar module Eagle, while Michael Collins remained in orbit above. When Armstrong stepped onto the moon, he spoke words that would echo through history. "That's one small step for man, one giant leap for mankind." It was more than a technical victory. It was a human moment, astonishing, fragile, and almost impossible to imagine just a generation earlier. For the first time, human beings stood on another world. The moon landing marked the high point of the space race, but it did not end spaceflight. Instead, the focus began to shift. By the 1970s, both the United States and the Soviet Union were looking beyond one-time triumphs toward longer-term presence in space. The Soviets invested heavily in space stations, launching a series of orbital laboratories under the Salyut program and later Mir. The Americans, after the last Apollo missions, launched Skylab, their first space station. There was also a brief moment of symbolic cooperation. In 1975, American and Soviet spacecraft met in orbit during the Apollo-Soyuz test project. Astronauts and cosmonauts shook hands in space, offering a rare image of détente during the Cold War. In the United States, NASA then turned toward a new idea, the Space Shuttle. The shuttle was designed to make spaceflight more flexible and, in theory, more affordable. Unlike earlier capsules, it was partially reusable. It could carry large payloads, deploy satellites, conduct experiments, and help build structures in orbit. When Columbia first launched in 1981, it seemed to represent the future. And in some ways, it did. Over 3 decades, the shuttle carried astronauts from many countries, launched major scientific missions, helped deploy the Hubble Space Telescope, and played a central role in assembling the International Space Station. But the shuttle era also revealed the harsh realities of complexity and risk. In 1986, Challenger broke apart shortly after launch, killing all 7 crew members. Then, in 2003, Columbia disintegrated during re-entry, again killing 7 astronauts. These disasters forced painful reflection on engineering, management, and the true cost of human spaceflight. Meanwhile, robotic exploration was flourishing. Even when humans were not traveling farther into the solar system, our machines were. Probes visited the outer planets. Rovers explored Mars. Space telescopes transformed astronomy. Missions like Voyager, launched in 1977, kept going for decades and carried human-made objects farther than anything else ever built. Then came another major transformation: international cooperation. In the late 1990s and early 2000s, former rivals came together to build the International Space Station, or ISS. The United States, Russia, Europe, Japan, and Canada all contributed. Orbiting roughly 400 kilometers above Earth, the station became a permanent laboratory in space and a symbol of what collaboration could achieve. Astronauts lived there continuously. Scientists studied the effects of microgravity on the human body, materials, plants, and technology. The ISS was not as dramatic as the moon landing, but it represented something equally important: sustained human presence in orbit. Still, by the early 21st century, spaceflight seemed to be at a crossroads. The grand momentum of Apollo was long gone. The shuttle was aging. Launches were expensive. Human missions beyond low Earth orbit had stalled. That is where private industry began to change the story. For decades, space had been dominated by governments. Private companies built hardware, but national agencies set the agenda. In the 2000s, that began to shift. New companies emerged with the goal of reducing launch costs, improving reliability, and opening access to space. The most influential of these was SpaceX, founded in 2002 by Elon Musk. At first, many experts were skeptical. Spaceflight had defeated huge governments and aerospace giants. Why would a startup succeed where others had struggled? SpaceX's early years seemed to confirm those doubts. The company's first rocket, Falcon 1, failed on its first 3 launches. But in 2008, Falcon 1 finally reached orbit. It was a breakthrough, and it came at a crucial moment for the company. From there, SpaceX moved quickly. It developed the Falcon 9, a much more powerful rocket, and Dragon, a spacecraft designed to carry cargo and eventually people. NASA, looking for new ways to resupply the ISS after the shuttle's retirement, became an important customer and partner. Then, SpaceX achieved something many had talked about for years, but few had managed in practice: rocket reusability. Traditionally, rockets were used once and discarded, like throwing away an airplane after every flight. SpaceX changed that by landing the first stage of Falcon 9 and flying boosters again. It was one of the most important shifts in launch economics since the dawn of the space age. Reusability did not make space cheap overnight, but it made frequent launches far more realistic. In 2020, SpaceX reached another milestone when Crew Dragon carried astronauts to the International Space Station. For the first time, a privately developed spacecraft transported humans into orbit as part of an operational mission. It was also the first crewed orbital launch from U.S. soil since the shuttle retired in 2011. By then, SpaceX was not just another contractor. It was helping redefine the structure of the industry. Its rapid launch cadence, reusable boosters, and ambitious development culture pushed competitors to adapt. Companies and agencies around the world began rethinking how space missions should be designed, funded, and flown. Space was no longer only a domain of superpower governments. It had become a broader ecosystem of national agencies, private firms, startups, and international partnerships. And SpaceX did not stop with crew transport. It launched large numbers of satellites through Starlink, pursued deep space ambitions with the massive Starship vehicle, and positioned itself at the center of future plans for lunar and possibly Martian missions. That brings us to the present moment. Today, the history of spaceflight is no longer a simple story of America versus the Soviet Union. It is a more crowded, more commercial, and more global story. NASA is preparing to return astronauts to the moon through Artemis. China has built its own space station and expanded its lunar ambitions. India has made major advances in robotic and human spaceflight planning. Europe, Japan, and many newer space nations are shaping the field in different ways. But the long arc is still visible. Spaceflight began as a weapon-driven technology, became a symbol of Cold War rivalry, evolved into a platform for science and cooperation, and has now entered an era of commercialization and renewed exploration. The space race was about proving which system could reach the heavens first. The new era is about something different. Who can build a lasting presence there? Who can lower the cost of access? And who can turn space from a rare frontier into a working environment? From Sputnik's lonely beeps to footprints on the moon, from fragile capsules to reusable rockets landing upright on drone ships, the story of spaceflight has always been a story of ambition stretching beyond current limits. And maybe that is why it still captures us. Because every rocket launch carries the same basic question. What happens when a species that evolved on one planet decides it does not want to stay there? That's all for today. If you enjoyed this episode, thanks for listening. And wherever the next chapter of spaceflight leads, back to the moon, on to Mars, or into futures we can barely imagine, we'll be watching.